My main strategy, I mean, if it's a simple thing to answer, is like I have not ever focused on being like fluent or, mastering a certain test or a certain like skill. I try to connect with each language through the heart. I try to listen to the rhythm of the language. I try to I try to connect with, have a relationship with that language or that culture, and yeah, then let it have a place, also allow the language to take its place in me, if that makes sense, at whichever level it is.
It's interesting because like you guys, you're talking about these languages. It's like, oh, it's like our natural feel, but like me as I'm listening to them, it's like that's a lot of work in general. Like even if it's not considered like actual, like you said, like the skill of learning the language and not trying to be that high level fluent, it's still like extremely impressive, and in the background there's still a lot of work done. But this thing about switching and having kind of uneven language consistency, you think of one language, you respond with the other, you change in the moment. Could you maybe recall a time or a specific period in your life when you realized that this unevenness in language learning could be powerful and it could be this meaningful?
Yeah, I think at some point, maybe my first moment was when I was in Italy, in Arco. It's a region in North Italy, in the Trentino area, which was, like I said, the first place I, came to in Europe. And I was in this small town where not many people spoke English. I mean, the friend I was with, they spoke English, but people around me, it was just Italian. And I had studied French. I didn't speak any Italian. But then what I realized is that my knowledge of French somehow already made it possible for me to understand a bit. And I started experiencing that unevenness, that you're talking about. I needed to recognize that there is some knowledge, like there is some connection here between French and Italian that is carrying me and making it possible for me to engage. And I just basically went into the flow of Italian. And at that point, I couldn't even, like, I didn't know. I was just speaking, I was kind of repeating sounds that made sense in a way. I didn't know what was a verb and what was a subject or something. I was just producing those sounds. It was very late that I could distinguish between this is the pronoun, this is the subject, that's the word that they're actually saying, because it was all flowing so much. And that, but it's just that unevenness, that became a strength, because there is a passive unevenness also comes because there is some passive knowledge, there is something in you. And yeah, that's I would say that was the first moment where I was quite aware.
It's funny because, like, at its core, French and Italian are extremely similar languages in terms of structure and grammatical rules. Like, if you read them on a book, you'll be like, what is this? These are the same language, but the sound is the major change in between those two languages. So the fact that you could pick up the sounds of Italian from French is like you're even more against on high, it's already steep as a level to understand these sort of things. And it's even funnier because that region probably has a lot more German speakers than French speakers. So because that part is it's closer to those areas as well. So it's like that's already like so many different cultures and sounds already blended into one, and being able to pick up on those, that's wow.
Yeah, it's really amazing when I hear that, like that you learned late, like what was a pronoun and a noun and an adjective and a verb in the language. It was super interesting to me. Is it, just out of curiosity, would you describe yourself as a person who is very structured or who is more intuitive? Because, for example, I'm a structured person, and I think I could not be able to learn a language only intuitively. I'm really impressed by that.
It's I would Well, I am very structured, but it's if there is a space between intuition and structure, because you can also be intuitively structured. And the thing is, where does that structure come from, outside, or is it a structure that is coming from inside? Because I do believe that we are making sense of things ourselves. all the time. The issue I have with a lot of, I mean, I'm also very grateful to all my language teachers and all the language classes. Okay, so so I don't want to, I don't want to, I am very, yeah, of course, we learn through those structures too, but I also think we have our own way of entering those structures. And sometimes you might make connections which are not already present to the teacher's knowledge, or the didactic materials that are given to you. And the reason I think so when I say something being intuitively structured is also kind of maybe being more aware of how is it that you are connecting with the language, what are the connections that you are making, which may not be that obvious. And I think that's a very important part. And then you can start, like, I would start creating the commonalities and finding the connections. So this has, yeah, that I think this awareness helps to listen to your own intuition.
I really want to continue on the element of the connection, not only because it's the name of the podcast itself, but also because we've been talking a lot of like like you can make connections to people, but I kind of want to know a little bit more specific, like in what ways do you think language has helped you connect with people? It could be like across your daily life, but also I think that would be very important for the core of this episode, academically, professionally, or even like an international space.
Yeah, thank you. So let's just go back to French then in that case, because because when I started, so I picked French as the second language in high school, and I was fascinated with Europe for some reason. Since I was, especially I think through my high school, I started becoming even more fascinated with Europe, and French then also became a language that gave me more connection to, let's say, French, modern, like theater or philosophy and so on. I couldn't actually, of course, read philosophy or theater and literature in French with the level I had then, but it did start giving me an awareness of what kind of art or culture is out there. And philosophy is the subject that I started pursuing. And I did study Indian philosophy, but I was not that drawn into learning Sanskrit or going deep into that area. But French was kind of more the anchor for me. In terms of like coming into more academic knowledge. And then I studied when I studied German, it was also this idea that okay, because the French philosophers were interacting a lot with the German philosophers, and they were then it turns out like, okay, if you want to understand what they're saying, somehow you need to understand what the Germans were saying. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I'll also like learn a bit of like German. And I have to specify here or emphasize, I couldn't read all these texts then, but I could start getting into the culture and the history and the context, and understanding also the people when I was visiting these places later. The similar thing started happening when I was also learning Norwegian, because I got a scholarship to study in Norway, and I had never thought about this language before. It just ended up in Norway, started studying that. But all these languages started giving me access also to reading text, or picking up words or concepts in these languages, which then opened up the space for me to look beyond English. Because one of the issues with the academic world is really the how English is just so dominant, and more or most of the academics in the world study English. If you're not coming from an English speaking country, they're forced to look into text, translate them from into their own languages, and then learn to write academic English and express in a language that is not their own. But there's such just a rich there's so much like richness in different languages that could also somehow connect with each other. And a lot of the references that people might end up reading and citing in the works that they're writing end up being English, which is quite unfair. It's unfair